Welcome back to the Colne Valley Postal History Museum here in sunny Halstead, Essex. In this instalment of our virtual tour of the museum, I thought we'd take a closer look at some of the stuff in Shed 1, in particular some of the smaller items that you can see here, the postbox miniatures in particular, because they can really help me to tell you a little bit about the history of the British wayside letterbox. Because however good this collection, or any collection really in the UK is, you can never hope to have all of the boxes in one place at one time. So the miniatures are quite an interesting way of looking at the history. The whole thing started off in 1853 on the Channel Islands when a gentleman called Anthony Trollope, who was at that time the surveyor for the Western District of the Post Office, but also better known as a novelist in Victorian times, was beseeched by the people of the Channel Islands to come up with some way of collecting the post from them so that they didn't have to keep going down to the harbour and handing it over to the captain of the packet boat, the boat that brought the mail in from the mainland, because of course that depended on the tides and the weather. So Mr. Trollope duly went to the Channel Islands and conducted the survey of Jersey and Guernsey in 1852, and he came back and recommended the use of something which he'd seen in Paris the previous year, which was a letter receiving pillar. And we have a model of what he came up with just here. So if we just pull out a little bit, this is postbox number 1. As you can see, it's hexagonal. It's got the royal cipher on the back here and a letter slot at the top here, which is horizontal. Now, these were made in Jersey by the foundry of Vaudan, and they were erected at the end of 1852 in Jersey. So they technically had the first ones anywhere in the United Kingdom, and then in January of 1853 in Guernsey, where there is still one of these to be seen at Union Street in St. Peter Port. In fact, if I come in a little bit, you'll see that that does say box number 1 on it, and that is the one at Union Street. We have a direct connection to that box, because if I swing around over here to one of our little letterboxes here and open this one, that is a later Union Street collection plate, kindly supplied by the Guernsey Post Office. So that is off postbox number 1. Back to the story. So back to the miniatures. So these were great. They were very, very well received, and before long there was a clamour to have them erected on the mainland. And the first one was erected at Botchergate in Carlisle in 1853. But unfortunately, we don't have any drawings, and no engravings. We don't know what it looked like. It certainly wasn't made by Vaudan, and no one really seems to know what that box looked like. But if you go there today, what you'll see on the site, if we come up to here, is a replica penfold. So one of these with a little plate on it that says this is the site of the first mainland postbox. Now, it wasn't until 1855 that London got post boxes, and theirs were rectangular. They were made by Gristle and Company of Hoxton in East London, and as you can see, they're rather wonderful, aren't they? They've got a nice big, what I used to think was enamel, but turns out to be cast plate on this side, telling you which postbox number it is and how far it is from the general post office. And then all the rate information was on this side on another cast plate. Now the good news is that that plate has survived and is in the National Collection. There was an entire box in the contractor's yard, and unfortunately in World War II it was hit by a bomb and destroyed. So the very last of the London boxes went that way. But 1855, Gristle of London. So what happened next was the various area surveyors around the country decided that they wanted their own boxes, and there was no kind of standardisation at that time, so they could have whatever they drew basically and sent to their local foundry. And the Southern District, which included Birmingham, went for a fluted pillar, which you can see here in green, except that on their drawing it was misinterpreted by the foundry, and they gave it this huge bulbous crown. Isn't that rather wonderful? I'm going to move it away from the background so we can have a closer look at it. Let's bring it down here. Look at that. Now, 3 of these were made, and there are pictures of at least one of them in West Bromwich. The only survivor is currently inside a large property at Goffs Oak in Hertfordshire, and is the subject of a long-running, like from 1960s, legal dispute over its location and ownership, which I understand may or may not be coming to a conclusion fairly soon. But as a result of that, it's quite hard to see. I was lucky enough to get permission to go and have a look at it a few years ago. It's quite something. Now, they quite quickly realised that the fluted pillar surmounted by a crown and dome shouldn't really look like that. It should look like that. Much nicer. If we turn it around that way, you can see where the crown should be there, of course, with the royal cipher. And then you've got a vertical aperture on these. The Victorians decided fairly early on that vertical apertures made it much more difficult for the post to spill out, and also presumably more difficult for the urchins of the day to try and steal the post. So the vertical aperture was employed quite significantly in those days. And you can see another smaller model of the same thing next to it. Now, we haven't got models of all of the very early boxes, but one we do have is here in the centre there, the red one, which is the London Ornate box. And that's got decoration all the way around it, which is part of the casting. They were also known as the Science and Art box because they were designed by the Committee for Science and Art of the House of Lords. So that's what a House of Lords Science and Art box looks like. 3 have survived. There's one in Salford in the museum there. That survived because it was on the floor of the Manchester Stock Exchange for many years. And there are 2 in the National Collection in Loughton in London, in store at the moment. And an economy version without all of that decoration on it was also made, and one of those has survived, and it's in the Kent railway station in Cork in the Republic of Ireland. Now, you're probably wondering what's next to it. You see we've got another smaller model of the giant fluted there, but to the right of that is the Liverpool Special, and that's a wonderful box, isn't it, with a big blue crown on the top. If you've been to the Albert Dock in Liverpool, you might have seen one of these. There's one there which is available for posting. There's another one in store that was at Copperas Hill, just outside Lime Street Station, and there's one in the National Collection in London. I think 9 or 10 of these were made for Liverpool because the volume of posting on the streets of Liverpool was considerably higher than elsewhere in the country, and so they requested and were allowed permission to have a much bigger postbox made just for their use. Let's come back and have a look at something else that we don't have in our collection, but there are still plenty of these on the street, and that's the Airmail pillar box, the blue one there. These are quite distinctive. They're reign of George V, so they've got a big GR cipher on. They were made in 1932 when the Airmail service started, and as you can see, they've got a twin collection plate holder. And the collection plates were actually paper pasted to card, and that's because these plates here actually show the times at which the aeroplane is going to leave Croydon Airport for various parts of the empire, and on the other side the amount of money it's going to cost you to send a letter to, say, Australia or Canada. In fact, it didn't just show the times, it showed the days of the week, because the service wasn't daily. So if you wanted to send a letter to Australia, there were 2 flights a week, one via India and one via South Africa. If you wanted to send stuff to Canada, there were 2 a week, and one of those was extended from Halifax, Nova Scotia, down to New York, so that those goddamn Yankees could get the post as well. Now, airmail boxes were all withdrawn off the street in 1939 when the war started, and then after the war, the twin plates were mostly removed, the boxes were painted red, and they tended to just end up on new housing estates, and consequently there's about 100 of them dotted around the country. Sometimes you can scrape a little bit of the red paint away and see the blue underneath still. Around the doors, typically you can see it. And we're very fortunate there's one in Rain Road in Braintree. That's our nearest one. And if it ever gets knocked over by an HGV, you can be sure I'll be down there to collect the bits. Sorry about that, just knocked something very heavy and it fell off. So I apologise for the picture going all wonky. So that's just a little introduction there to some of the boxes that we don't have in the collection. As you can see, we've also got lots and lots of other miniatures here, but these are mostly things that we do have. We'll come back and have a look at collection plates